you have the handouts is what you have here. There may be a few details added here and there, but I just wanted to not to have too much information that will overwhelm you. So what matters is what is in the handout. But for anyone who wants to get a little bit more, there'll be some other material that will be presented here. And also at the end of this session, we're going to have another 10 minutes or 5 to 10 minutes presentation on one aspect that is important about what we are talking about. And then we're going to have 5 minutes for questions, and we'll conclude today's class. So again, this is the foundational course on astrology, what we call kingdom astrology, because this is the Messianic kingdom astrology. And I hope you can also see in the screen, on the screen, the display. This is, so we're going to begin by assigning a definition of what astrology is. If you're part of us during the, when I began this ministry, I was talking a lot on Facebook, and we were talking about redefining us. So we were tempted to come up with a definition of astrology that covers everything astrology is about, and one that offers an idea of not only what astrology is, but why it is necessary and how it is to be used, especially in this age, which is important for us, especially we who are in the church, but for the entire world as well. So our definition of astrology is, as in your handout, it is a study of one, the alignments, and secondly, transits of celestial bodies. Now, those are so that we can be able to design and understand the progress of time. We also need to do it to understand science. We need to understand seasons. And finally, we also need to understand what we call time dispensations. Now, we're going to have, in the next session, we're going to look at all these terms that we have brought here. Now, why is it necessary for us to have astrological knowledge? Now, astrological knowledge is necessary for us to be able to first harness what we call divine energy, and also to exert influence, not only in human affairs, but also divine affairs. And these affairs, human affairs, take place on two kinds of universes, what we call the material universe and also the spiritual universe. Now, before we go ahead, I would like to say this. Everyone is an astrologer, because as you find, we are talking about an understanding of time. There's no way you can understand time and passage of time without understanding astrology. And actually, this is the feature that is mostly missing from every kind of, especially secular definitions of what astrology is. They take it out and then they think about it as only using influences from celestial sphere. But if you're a person who ever tells time by using such terms as AM or PM, or you talk about this being the first or the second month, or this being a week, this being the first or the second day of the week, there is no definition of a week or a month or even an hour or a year without an understanding of how astrological bodies do it. So now you can understand, you can either be an astrologer who understands the meaning and who uses astrology in accordance to what God purposed from the beginning, or you can do it either in deception or in ignorance. So we want to be able to be astrologers who not only use astrology in understanding, but we also have, we are able to exert our own influence on it. So that is the definition, but for us to understand the definition, let's look at some of the terms that are important in astrology. The first term we got in our definition is celestial body. So what is a celestial body? So a celestial body is any of the bright luminaries which traverse the celestial sphere over the course of time. So when time passes, celestial bodies do traverse what we call the celestial sphere. And we're going to cover this one more in the next unit and also the second and the third unit of it. First of all, we'll do this, we will talk about the celestial sphere from an understanding of what the Bible defines it. Then we'll look at it at how we can be able to define it from our own observations from what we call the terrestrial sphere. But to an astrologer, a celestial body can either be a star or a planet. Again, we'll be able to offer these definitions later as we go on. This is all you need to know for the purpose of this course at this juncture. But I would say a star is usually something that is stuck on the celestial sphere. So we have a celestial sphere that goes round the world as it is, and on it there are points that are permanently stuck there. Those points that are bright points on that celestial sphere, those are stars. They define the boundaries of various divisions of a celestial sphere because they are permanently in one place. But then there are other celestial bodies that do not stick to one division of a celestial sky, but they do move over time. And these ones we call them planets. Again, we'll cover this one a lot more in the third unit of this course. So for now, what you need to know is that any celestial body can only be classified as either a star or a planet. The next term we are talking about is what we call an alignment. Alignment, actually, this is where the bulk of astrological work is. It is in alignment because alignments, this is the one that gives us what we call planetary geometry and stellar geometry that is able to give us signs and signals about things happening. And this also defines some, we talked about astrology being a way to exert influence. So you exert influence according to the indicators that are given, depending on the alignments that are there on the celestial sphere. Now, how do we know that two celestial bodies, either planets or stars, are aligned? One of the ways to tell it is if they lie on what is a line or a great circle that defines the celestial grid. Secondly, they could be within a specified span. That means it needs to be defined. You must define that span first. And if bodies lie within that, then we talk of that being an alignment. Now, again, sometimes celestial systems are located within certain meaningful angles. And that one, again, can be defined as an alignment. I was trying to record this and, oh yeah, it's already recording, sorry. So these are the three ways. Again, these ones, they are very broad definitions of what alignment is. But I'd like to just give one example, a common example of an alignment that we see, and actually one of the most important alignments. Alignments actually can be divided when it comes to planets alone, especially with regards to planets. They can be defined as opposition, and you could take a note. I don't know whether maybe I can give the word opposition. Let me see if I can write it here on the screen. So opposition is just as you would write it. Again, this is a term that I've not included in what that means. It may not be very important for the purposes of this unit, but an opposition is an alignment that happens when two celestial bodies, either planets or stars, are on either side of a celestial grid. A very good example that happens every month is what we call a full moon. So a full moon is when the sun is on one side of the celestial sphere and then the moon is on the other one, and then we get a full moon. The other one is actually the right opposite of opposition, and that is what we call a conjunction. I don't know whether my writing will be very good here. But this is how we write conjunction. Okay, and then it should be enough for me to move it there. Let me move my screen down here. So that is how a conjunction is. And again, a conjunction is right opposite of what an opposition is. And with regard to the moon and the sun, we get a conjunction of the moon and the sun at the new moon. And it usually indicates the birth of a new month, which is a full cycle of a moon. Again, we are going to learn more about these ones, I think, in the 4th unit of this course. Now, we come to the other point for which defines the basics of astrology, and that is a transit. A planetary or stellar transit is when a planet or a star passes across one of the lines that define the grid, a grid on the celestial sphere. We only have one celestial sphere, and that is the whole universe. And then on this celestial on the universe, we can usually have different kind of grids. Grids are just like a network of circles. And when a star passes one of the major lines that are defined, then we say it's doing a transit. Again, we're going to cover this more, I think, in the 4th unit of this course. Now, we talk about progress of time, which is a very essential part of astrology. Actually, most of astrology does not make sense because people, when they talk about astrology, they're just talking about alignments, but you don't have a systematic way of marking the progress of time. So if you don't have a systematic way of marking progress of time, then you are not mapping the alignments and the transits of planets and stars to a system that can give you influence. So we mark time, the progress of time, you use either clocks and calendars. So clocks normally are more short term, so they can give you like the divisions within one day. And then these times that are marked on a clock on a wider concept, so they would be marked on what we call a calendar. So a calendar normally would give you the progress of time over maybe a period of a year or a month. And then we use clocks for maybe a day or an hour. So clocks and how you divide your clocks and how you use the celestial bodies to it and how they mark time is very important. Now, all over the world, we can see there are various ways of marking the progress of time and various calendars. So one of the most popular secular calendar system conceives time as moving in linear fashion. But there are other systems that conceive time as moving in a cyclic fashion. That means after maybe a rate of progress of a defined time of year, then we have another cycle of years that replicates the same periods of time that were marked in the various in the previous cycle. Again, this is something we'll cover, I think, in the 6th unit of our course. So we'll see much more of these times and about calendars and clocks in that part of our course. So then we talk about signs. Now, signs are usually defined by, actually sometimes they can be defined by the two terms we've just gone through, the transits and alignments. But we call a sign an unusual or a rare appearance of alignments on the celestial sphere. These special alignments or appearances, they indicate the happening of significant events. Sometimes they indicate the beginning or ending of seasons, time periods, and dispensations. Like we just talked about the conjunction, like of the moon and the sun. Now, this is usually a sign, like the conjunction of the moon and the sun is a sign of the beginning of a month. Again, we have indicators that give us indications of the beginning or the ending of a year. Again, as I've said, we're going to talk about dispensations a little bit later. Then we have what we call a season. So what is a season? A season is a relatively short span of time that is usually defined normally by abundance. Abundance means there's a lot, or paucity, or there's a little of certain provisions or influences. So normally you see that again, this needs to be understood within the concept of the spiritual and the material universe. So we inhabit the material universe, but we are able to affect the spiritual universe. So sometimes you get these influences. So you can get influences that enable you to effect changes and things happening on the spiritual or the material universe. And then that period that is defined by that availability of that influence, we call it a season. Then there could be a season that is not defined by that availability, then there's little of it. So it is important to be able to understand these seasons. I say they are relatively short because these ones, we are comparing them to what we call time dispensations. And I'm sure Pastor Kevin will speak to us about dispensations a little bit later. Now, seasons can be ordinary or they can be special. Like they're usually ordinary seasons, even in the material world, like there is a seasons of the sun. The sun usually has 4 seasons that define together a year. We have winter, we have summer, we have spring, and we have what we call autumn or fall. So there are different kinds of seasons, and these ones, when they are defined with the astrological signs, they're accompanied by astrological signs, then they get more meaning. We come to what we call a time dispensation. Now, a time dispensation, according to our school of astrology, is either a God-ordered, so something ordered by God or ordained by God, and it's a time period. And this time period is usually defined by a system of order of doing things. It can also be defined by a consciousness of a people and also a nation or a world. Now, a season can be very personal, but a time dispensation is not personal. It's something that spans a lot more than just one person, but I don't want to go into a lot of details. We'll have some few more minutes, as I said, with Kevin explaining to us. Time dispensations often span hundreds or thousands of years. Sometimes you can have dispensations that last for many, many years, many, many centuries or millennia. Then finally, we have what we call the material universe. Now, the material universe is also called the natural universe. And this is what we can define it academically as a collection of matter and energy that can be discerned using what we call sensory perception. That means you can see it. It is possible to see it. It's possible to hear certain aspects of it. Or you can measure those, the manifestation of that material universe using scientific instruments. Like we have telescopes. Today we have telescopes that can be able to look back in time up to about almost 14 billion years. So these ones, every collection of items that can be discerned by those instruments. And these instruments, sometimes they can see beyond what we can see. So they use what we call maybe infrared or ultraviolet or sometimes X-ray, which is beyond the perception of the human eye, and they are able to perceive that world. So that is what we call the material universe. If you go to what we call science, science believes that material universe is all there is. But there's a lot of evidence that shows us it's not just the material universe. It's not only what you can measure using sensory perception or be able to map using a scientific instrument that really exists. Now, we come to the spiritual universe. Now, the spiritual universe is also sometimes called the supernatural universe. We can define the spiritual universe or the supernatural universe as the reality and system of consciousness which transcends sensory perception. So here we're not just talking about matter, we're not just talking about energy, but you're talking a reality, about a reality, a level of truth, and a system of consciousness, sometimes something that you can conceive. But this one is beyond what you can see with the sensory perception. There is an argument whether the spiritual universe and the material universe exist on one continuum. Like, where do you draw the boundary between what is material and what is natural? What is natural and what is supernatural? And again, that is not the objective of this course. So we'll not take too much time in that argument. Now we come to the last part of our presentation tonight, and that is looking at what is called astronomy and astrology. And again, this is just another facet of looking at what we call the material universe and the supernatural universe. There's a lot of arguments that go about what is astrology. And if you take a very limited definition of what astrology is, then astrology is usually defined as a pseudoscience. Pseudo means it is false. Why do they say it's false? Because they say none of the propositions that are proposed by people who call them astrologers can be tested and falsified using certain means. And that one takes us directly to what we define as astronomy. So the major difference between astronomy and astrology is that astronomy appeals to what we call empirical truth. Now, this is philosophy actually, and you can learn more about if you've done something like education. If you trained being a teacher, you may have learned something. If you've done a basic course in philosophy at college, you may have done something that is called, I think, epistemology. Epistemology is a field of philosophy that is concerned with the question, how do we know what we know? So astronomy is the study of celestial bodies and phenomena using empirical principles. So what are empirical principles, or what is empiricism? Empirical truth is truth that you can derive from sensory perception and experiences. So it's something you can use sensory perception and experience and be able to measure it, as you've talked about in the last section, measure it and be able to do what we call thesis that can be falsified using the same empirical then you call that one an empirical science. But this one cannot serve us to do astrology, because astrology appeals to a higher kind of knowledge. And this one now takes us to the last section of what astronomy is when you compare it to astrology. And there is a problem, there is an issue with this definition. I don't know whether it's only on my word, because it speaks about astronomy again. Oh God, sorry, I've not moved to the last. Oh, sorry. It's me who had not moved to the last slide. So there's a last slide, okay, that now speaks about astrology, not astronomy. So astrology appeals to what we call eternal truth. Now, astrology builds on the principles and findings of astronomy by appealing to what we call eternally established truths. And when we take this view, what we see is that now astronomy is cannot be viewed as a pseudoscience, and rather astrology cannot be viewed as a pseudoscience. And there needs not be a conflict between what astronomy and astrology is. Astronomy makes observations using sensory perception. Even ourselves, as we do astrology, we still be doing sensory observations. And these sensory observations, they open up a world that you cannot inquire from using sensory what, and that is what we call eternally established truths. These eternally established truths, we believe they are established in the Bible. In the next unit, we're going to talk more about the biblical basis for astrology. And as we do it, we are going to look at some of the truths that the Bible defines, and we're going to look at principles that guide every kind, that should guide every kind of a well-established astrological system. So these truths are the ones that are going to guide us, and we are not just going to restrict ourselves, as we say, from just the Bible, but we will use it to like form a fence so that we will not have any one of the findings that we're going to find in astronomy, in our astrological classes. It's not going to be in opposition to the truths that have already been established in the Bible. And as I've said, when you take such a view, then you see that astronomy is no longer in opposition to us, or rather, astrology is no longer in opposition to astronomy, but rather, astronomy is a subset of astrology. Astrology lies far higher than what we call astronomy. There's somebody, as I finish, I remember in college, I used to have a friend who used to say, fame, which astrology must also appeal to faith, because some aspects you'll not be able to use normal sight, is not that it is illogical. And the same thing, astrology is not that it is illogical. It's only that it appeals to something that is far above logic. If you use material logic to define and try to either disprove or prove astrology, then you fail, because it's a science that is a lot higher than logic. So that marks the end of our class. I'm glad that we have been, you have listened to me. Right now, I would like to welcome Pastor Kevin, who is going to give us a small talk on what we call time dispensations. And then afterwards, I hope you'll have maybe 5 minutes that you can raise your question. You can either direct your question to either me or to Pastor Kevin. You can use a chat. You can use the chat feature to ask your question, or you can also raise your hand, and I'll be able to give you a chance to ask your question live. Thank you so much.
So hi. Thank you, Jack. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to talk about dispensation in I'll make it as fast as possible. So first of all, what is a dispensation? I will say a dispensation is a biblical history as divided by God. Dispensation can also be called ages. You've heard what people say, like ages. And they are mostly dispensations are like housekeeping rules that operate at a particular point in time and a particular human steward. So there's the aspect of where God initiates a dispensation, but it's mostly tied to a human being on earth. So it's more of God and man working together in unison. So you also need to understand that God is not a dispensationalist, but it's because of the human culturing and how the human being has cultured himself that forces God to bring in dispensations. But you as a human being, you have the ability to live beyond dispensations if you're willing. If you remember the story of somebody like David lived beyond the dispensation that he was in. We're going to look at the dispensation that he was in. So first of all, you need to note that dispensations can also be called ages. Like now we're talking about kingdom age. That's also like a dispensation. And you must note that dispensations are different from covenants. Covenants are a completely different thing. They're different from dispensations. So in a history of dispensations, dispensational theology was first started by a guy called John Nelson Darby. Darby was a theologian. He was the one who was able to look at the scriptures and put the dispensations in place according to the understanding that he had at that time. So Darby was succeeded by a theologian called C.I. Scofield, and then it continued on going from one person to the other. So we have about 7 dispensations. So the first dispensation is is called the dispensation of innocence, or the Edenic dispensation. This is the dispensation from the creation of man to the fall of man. In this place is where Adam was considered innocent. That's why it's called the dispensation of innocence, or the age of innocence. In this time, Adam was innocent. And now, if you understand what innocence means, it means that you are able to also appreciate the fact that Adam fell, because in innocence, it means he was still lacking in some things. So also it means even the aspects of maturity, I don't attain some aspects of maturity. So that's why he was still in the innocent stage. So that is the first dispensation. It is found in Genesis chapter 1, from chapter 1, verse 26, 27 to around chapter 3, where Adam falls. And now sin comes in. Now, when sin comes in, we go into the second dispensation. The second dispensation is the dispensation of conscience, or sometimes it's called by theologian antediluvian. This is after the fall of Adam. Now Adam goes from innocence. Now he goes into the area of conscience. At this point, there was no law, so Adam was living mainly on the people living between that period were living mainly on the aspect of conscience. So in that dispensation, it goes from the fall to the great flood. And you see, dispensations are something that you can notice. Dispensation, they can take years, they can take a lot of time, depending on told you depends on a human being's action that causes God to put in a particular dispensation based on what a human being stands up to do. So from the time of innocence, we don't know how many years it took, because we don't know how many years Adam stayed in the garden before he fell. So we don't know how many years it was. But in the dispensation of after the fall, the second dispensation of conscience is from after the fall to the great flood, where Noah comes in. In this aspect of dispensation, you can be able to see the years depending on how you count from the time there was the fall to the time that Noah came into the scene. So after the fall, after the flood, we go into the third dispensation. This after Noah goes into the ark and then comes out of the ark. There is a change of dispensation, and this dispensation called the dispensation of human government, or civil government. This one is after the flood. It is the time now where civilizations start to rise. If you look at it, it's from Genesis chapter 10, verse 8. There you can see people like Nimrod, who was mentioned, that it says that Nimrod was a mighty hunter in the eyes of God. And then Nimrod, he found kingdom like Babel, Erech, and Akkad. There are different kingdoms, and there you can start seeing civilizations springing up as a result of this time of civil government. It's also under this dispensation, the civil dispensation, whereby humanity enacted the death penalty. That someone could do something and there could be death penalty. So you see, even the death penalty that we have right now is not something that is just from today. It was something that was enacted by human beings from a long time ago. And if you are in church, when the last time Prophet Josh came, he told that he was teaching about culture, and he says sometimes human beings start a culture that God rides with. So some of these dispensations are also a work of human beings. So the human government, or the civil government dispensation, goes from after Noah comes out of the ark to the time of Abraham. Now, in the time of Abraham is what we call the promised dispensation, or the patriarchal dispensation. This comes from the time of Abraham to the time of Moses. This is where God promised Abraham, the promise he do was Christ, and he was told about Christ and the coming of Christ. So the age of the dispensation of the promise, or the patriarchal dispensation, goes on from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the sons. Then the tribe of Israel is born. Then they go into captivity. They go into captivity. They come from captivity. They go past the Red Sea until they get to Mount Sinai. In Mount Sinai, they come to the next part of the dispensation, which is called the law dispensation. This is the dispensation This is the dispensation from the time Moses went up the mountain and received the 10 commandments. So this is the dispensation of the law. And you know about the law. The law goes from the time of the law, the children of Israel enter the promised land. After they enter the promised land, we have the time of the judges, the time of kings, the time of the prophets, until now we come into the time of Jesus, because Jesus was also born under this same dispensation of law. If you read Galatians, it says Jesus was born under the law. So Jesus was born under the same dispensation of the law. So Jesus his entire life, he lives under the dispensation of the law. Then the dispensation of the law ends at the time of the cross. So it was at the cross that now they enacted a different dispensation, which is called the dispensation of grace. So from the cross going forward, after the death of Christ and his resurrection, that's when the new dispensation comes in, because now Christ ushers a new dispensation. It's called the dispensation of grace. Some also call it the church age. And this is mainly the dispensation that we are in. So under grace, is the grace dispensation is from the time of the cross to the time of the rapture of the church. And so also if you are a student of the things that are going on under the grace dispensation, there are also some different dispensations within the grace dispensation. There's the church age. You've heard about the kingdom age, but also there's the age of Melchizedek. There's also the age of rest. So these are also ages that are in between the grace age. But you see, the theologians who are doing this ended only at the grace age. But the grace age, there are different dispensations. The church age, there's the kingdom age, there's the age of Melchizedek, and then there's the age of rest. So these ones will go up to the seventh age, the seventh dispensation, which is the millennial kingdom. This is the 1,000-year reign of Christ. When Christ comes on earth to reign on earth physically for 1,000 years, he'll be reigning in Jerusalem, in Israel, in Jerusalem. So this one is the final dispensation. That's why it's called the millennial dispensation, because Christ reigns for 1,000 years on earth. So those are the dispensations that we have. Theologically, they say there are 7, but in essence, in the reality of what they are more than 7, because of the different ages under grace. They're like 4 different ages under the grace dispensation. So I'll hand over back to you, Jack.
Thank you so much, Pastor Kevin. That is very, very illuminating and a very timely message. Now, I only see one question that has been posted in the chat, and somebody asked, you mentioned there are telescopes that can see as far as billions of years ago. How is that achieved? To see through times through gadgets, to see through times through gadgets, okay? Time's gone through gadgets. Actually, the reality of the world, of this material world as God made it, it says one of the things people didn't realize for a very long time is that when you see through space, like now, if you can see some distance from yourself, from where you are, maybe you're in a room, you can see the far end of the room, that it takes a while because you see only by light, and light does not travel infinitely fast. That is what people thought, that sometimes that light travels at an infinite speed, because it takes time. If you're looking through space, then it takes time. And it happens that space and time are one, they're just aspects of the same thing. So if you look far enough, you're looking at a distance. If you can see a very long distance, then you're looking far back in time. And this one makes it possible actually for us to be able to enshrine actually some of the principles that I'm going to cover in the next 2 units, because every one of us happens to be at the center of their own universe. So when you're looking far back in time, some stars that we can see, actually any one of the stars that you can see outside is located so many billions of kilometers away that it takes at least many years for that light to come to us. So when you're looking at it, even with your own physical eyes, you don't need a gadget to look back in time. You can see some stars that the light you're seeing came from them maybe even 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. But when you make a much more sensitive instrument that can look even further, then that means it can be able to bring light that left these points in the universe many millions and billions of years back. So that is true. And it is an aspect of how God makes time pass. You know, in this material universe, time passes in a very linear fashion. But there is another universe which we can achieve consciousness in, which time doesn't travel, is not restricted by that. So when you see things in the material universe, there'll always be the aspect of the further they are, the further back they are in time. So that is essentially how it is done. And it's not, you don't need just an instrument. Even with your own eyes, you can be able to see back in time. Asilia Kobo asks, are the grids measured? Are they different from our known latitude and longitude? Are they measured by time or depth? That's a very good question. How are the grids measured? Actually, what happens, the grids that we speak about, longitude and latitude, these ones, they were astrological the concept which was like the equator. We talk about the equator, which is one of the lines of latitude. These ones, the equator didn't exist. People didn't know about, when people started studying the universe, the skies, astronomer, the first astrologers didn't know that the earth was a round sphere. They thought it was flat, that the earth was flat. So they didn't have an equator. There was no equator on earth, but there was an equator in the sky. Every one of these things, the North Pole and South Pole, it's only later geographers, they copied these terms from astronomers, from astrologers rather. So there used to be, there's a celestial equator that passes across the sky. So normally there are many grids that you can define, but they all span the same world. So again, these are things that we're going to touch on, especially from the third and the fourth units. We're going to speak about them more. So they are measured both by time and by distance. As I've said, time and distance are inseparable. And this is at the astronomical level. That is astronomy. That is purely astronomy. So it's something that is empirical. That can be proved using what I call empirical principles. Time and distance are basically the same thing. They're just different expressions of one truth. So we're going to look at this. I hope it will not be what we are going to cover it at a somehow basic level, but those people who'd like to maybe advance and do this so that they become real astrologers, then maybe there'll be other units. Even when we cover these ones, we'll cover them at a level that is foundational, because I believe we are doing these things at a foundational level. But you're going to cover these ones, this one clearer as you go on. I know maybe by today's presentation, I may have raised more questions than maybe answers, but that is because we couldn't be able to cram everything they're going to learn today. So we just gave the definitions, but some of these things will become clearer as we cover the other units. Thank you so much for that question. So I don't know whether there's somebody who has raised their hand yet. And I hope that I have managed to answer the question, those questions. If somebody feels that I have not answered the questions fully, you can still raise your hand again, or you can unmute your mic and say, maybe you need more clarification. Otherwise, we are going to be ending soon. I don't see any hands raised, so let us give thanks, and then we'll end in a couple of minutes. Father, King of Glory, we are thankful to you for this class. Thank you for bringing us to a very successful beginning. And we believe as we imprint a new consciousness, not only on ourselves, but in this world, that this will bring about a change of fortunes, not only for the church, but for the nations that believe in you, and that have a consciousness in you. Even as many things are happening at this time, We are willing and we are standing at your position so that we can enforce your will. We can enforce the plans of the ages that you've always wanted to be done in time. We thank you because we understand that our position is not for granted. We understand that everything we speak, or the words that we're speaking, we are not just speaking to ears, we are speaking to universes, we are speaking to beings, we are speaking to all creation, and we are bringing every thought to the obedience and to the eternal plan that you enforce and you brought into being as the foundations of this world are the one to come well laid. We thank you, we glorify you because we know you're preparing. The Lord Jesus is coming back, and we are wishing for him to come back and establish that millennium kingdom with us as a co-enforcers of his will and his authority on this world. Thank you for all that you've done for us. And even as we prepare for the Sunday service, we thank you that everything is going to happen as you have planned and as you have stood together with you in order to enforce your will and your purposes in this universe and even in the supernatural universe. We thank you and we glorify you, for we pray, believing in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you. Thank you so much for attending. We'll have what